So, I love video games. From Atari to PlayStation, they never seem to disappoint, sometimes. They've been a staple of my entire life, and I've played some games for so many hours that I've lost count. Something about the speed of Sonic and the incredible songs of Mario just draws me in. Among the different kinds of video games, I've always been fascinated with retro games. I love their rich history and the amount of love that was put into them. Because of my unhealthy love of retro games, and the fact I can win a PS2, I've decided to make this video where I celebrate retro gaming and explore some eras of video games that I'd consider retro. Starting off, I'd like to talk about the prehistoric era of video games, the Atari era. I'm not going to go too in-depth with this one because I want some time for the other eras. This era took off in the 70s and ended in the early 80s. During this time, Atari released bangers such as the 2600. The 2600 was massively successful with 30 million units sold, and it basically kickstarted the video game industry. It had games such as Dig Dug, E.T., I still have nightmares about this one, and Mario Bros. Yes, that's real. They did a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm too lazy to cover that. Atari was incredibly successful for a while, but with the great video game crash of 1983, it fell flat. When Nintendo released their Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, that literally killed Atari. Atari is dead. Sad. I know. Speaking of that brings us to our next era, the NES era. Yep, that's right, the famous playing card company Nintendo decided to release a video game system. Weird, I know. This system was 8-bit, meaning that it's super powerful. This thing could literally run games at 240p. Crazy, I know. This console had some pretty awesome games like Super Mario Bros., It's Super Now, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, where you play as my favorite male video game character, Metroid, Super Mario Bros. 3, the third, Donkey Kong, and Doki Doki Literature Club. Super Mario Bros. Was extremely popular because of its inclusion of the famous actor Chris Pratt. The NES had little to no competition in the USA and Japan, but in Europe, people were buying the Sega Master System, the creation of Nintendo's super dumb competition. No, I'm not biased, you are. At this time, Sega's mascot was Alex Kidd, who never really rose to the success that Mario did. While it was popular in Europe, it only sold around 10 million units, a sixth of what the NES sold. Aside from that stuff, Nintendo released the Game Boy during this generation. The Game Boy was one of the first handheld consoles. It had some great games, which it seemed to like displaying in very dark gray and puke. This thing was built like a brick, but even with its downsides, it's just impressive how they were able to make a portable console during the Cretaceous period. The Game Boy was a massive success and sold around 120 million units, making it the third best-selling console of all time. In our next era, we have the first console wars, the SNES versus the Genesis. During this era, Sega realized that they weren't going to be able to compete with the fat Italian plumber with a literal child as their mascot. So, they opted for a blue hedgehog. His name's Sonic. Get it, because he's fast. In terms of sales, the Genesis lost to Nintendo by about 18 million units, as Nintendo sold about 49 million SNESs, while Sega only sold around 31 million Genesises. Nintendo released their new Mario game, Super Mario World, which was a pretty good step up from the stuff on the NES. It included a carnivorous dinosaur named Yoshi, who eats every living thing in sight. I know, this is dark for a kid's game. The game follows the plot of, you guessed it, Mario saving Princess Peach from Jack Black. This game was a smash hit, but so was Sonic the Hedgehog. In Sonic, you play as Ben Schwartz and defeat a very large man. This was fun, and so were the two sequels, which introduced even more furries. Like Sonic, Super Mario World got a sequel, Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Islands. This game is personally my favorite on the console because of how darn fun it is. You play as Yoshi himself in this, and you get to help a younger version of Mario save his loser brother Luigi. Nintendo also released Super Metroid and A Link to the Past during this era, which were both great. To compete with the Game Boy, Sega released their Game Gear during this generation. It was way more powerful than its competitor and had a vibrant and backlit screen, as opposed to the Game Boy's obsession with the color of vomit. This thing was great, but it couldn't even touch the Game Boy's success with only 10 million units sold. After the failure of the Game Gear, Sega never released a handheld again. It really sucks to know that if the Game Gear didn't fail, then Sega would have probably released more handhelds and millions of people would be spared from the Game Boy's ugly color scheme. This era is probably one of my favorites because it introduced some of my favorite games ever, aka Sonic 2 and Super Mario World 2. In our next section of the video, we have the Virtual Boy era. The Virtual Boy existed. I'm done talking about this. In our next era, we have the introduction of 3D. Nintendo released the N64 in this era, aka the first 64-bit home console. The N64 could pump out shockingly good visuals. I mean, there are at least 3 polygons in this video. Amazing games such as Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time released on the N64. Conker's Bad Fur Day also did, but this is a kids channel. Some people even consider Ocarina of Time the best game ever. These games usually ran at 240p with some going a bit higher than that, which is so high it's insane. The only problem with these games is that they barely ran at over 3 FPS, so as a person who usually plays at 60 or higher, this makes me want to poke my eyes out. On Sega's side, they released the Sega Saturn, the best-selling console of all time with a whopping 5 units sold. On the system, Sega released Sonic 3D Blast, and that's about all I can remember. During this generation, we also got Sony's first console, the PlayStation. Sony did some partnering with Nintendo before, so they knew a thing or two about video game consoles. The PlayStation had some great games such as Crash Bandicoot, which is super easy, trust me. PlayStation sold way more than Nintendo, leaving them in the dust with over 100 million units sold. For context, the N64 only sold around 33. Nintendo also released the Game Boy Color during this generation, which was just the Game Boy minus the color blindness. This generation's really good because it introduced Gex Enter the Gecko. What more do I have to say?
I haven't seen blasts like this since taco night at James Earl Jones' house.
In our next era, we have the era that I don't have a name for. This era featured the PlayStation 2, which is a very imaginative name, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, Sega Dreamcast, and Xbox. The PlayStation 2 blazed ahead the competition this generation just like its predecessor with over 100 million units sold. In fact, it's now the best-selling video game console of all time. While it sold very well, I can't say the same about its competition. The Nintendo GameCube, while having great games like Mario Sunshine and The Wind Waker, sold terribly at only around 21 million units. This really sucks because the GameCube really did have some incredible games. Heck, Smash Bros. Melee is called the best in the franchise by some. The GameCube was a big step over the N64, with games actually having more than negative 31 polygons. The graphics in the GameCube's games are pretty good, and Nintendo actually stepped out of the incredibly low resolution realm and tried 480p for this console. Speaking of bad-selling consoles, we have the Sega Dreamcast. This didn't even hit the 10 million mark, and because of its terrible sales, basically marked the end of Sega selling consoles. Just like the GameCube, the Dreamcast had some great games like Sonic Adventure 2, which introduced the Edgelord, Shadow the Hedgehog, who got a spin-off with freaking guns. The Dreamcast controller also had a screen on it, so that was pretty cool. Also during this era, we got the Xbox, made by Bill Gates and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The Xbox sold around 24 million units, which isn't good, but it at least outsold the GameCube and Dreamcast. It brought gems such as Halo and a remaster of Conker's Bad Fur Day, but this is a kids channel, and I don't know anything else because I'm not an Xbox fan. As I said earlier, the Game Boy Advance had its debut in this generation. This is basically what would happen if somebody took the Game Boy Color, squished it down a bit and made it a bit wider, and upgraded the specs to ones that are similar to an SNES, which is exactly what they did. The Game Boy Advance had a really great library, which included some SNES ports, the Minish Cap, Harvest Moon, some Pokemon games, etc. Sadly, even with all these cool games, it still did not have a backlight, meaning that playing it in the dark was impossible. Luckily, the Game Boy Advance SP fixed this problem. This was basically the Game Boy Advance, the style of flip phone with a rechargeable battery and a backlight. Because of these new perks, the Game Boy Advance SP is probably the best Game Boy, but that's just an opinion. Because of the amount of consoles and fun games in this era, this is probably my favorite. In conclusion, retro games are really awesome. Without things like Sonic the Hedgehog and Super Mario Bros., we wouldn't be able to enjoy modern masterpieces such as Breath of the Wild and the new Golem game. They may not be the most technologically advanced things in the world, but they sure are some of the most fun. What do you feel about retro games? Comment your thoughts down below. Remember to subscribe, like, and hit the notifications bell. Don't forget to watch other playlists if you like the content, and if you don't, just don't. And I'm Kylojase, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!